Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I'd like to discuss an idea put forward about how the government are seeing the wave upon wave of industrial action, which they seem to be doing very little to even try to prevent. Why are they so determined to risk major damage to their credibility and inflict such human misery for no apparent gain? But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, we are increasingly seeing the phrase winter of discontent being thrown around in the news and social media. It's not because everyone in this silly country is a Shakespeare fan, although there's far too many, but because it's a fairly close parallel with the winter at the end of the 70s, when Labour were in power, when civil unrest, largely in the form of major strike action, ended their hopes of winning the election and ushered in the Thatcher years. It was known as the winter of discontent. We are seeing a level of unrest and industrial action now not seen since those days. It's not quite a parallel, because back in the 70s, strikes were a lot easier to organise, in that they were essentially driven by union leaders and organisers, much less so by the actual members. Membership was much higher as well. Industrial action far more tightly legislated now. They require a ballot of members to authorise, and the requirements for that ballot are more stringent than the elections which decide our national parliaments. It could be argued that a union ballot for industrial action is basically the most democratic process you can take part in the UK. It is unlawful to go on strike in sympathy with others, which was common in the 70s. You have to have your own genuine disputes with your employer. Basically, a properly authorised strike these days is very far removed from those that existed when I was just an infant, barely knowing what was going on. And so to see the scale of the action taking place right now is a real expression of just how bad things have become. Because you do not get strikes like this on the whim of the Labour leader or even union leaders. It can't happen. Now, the way I see it, simple enough. Everyone has their own ideas about what exactly justifies industrial action. For me, there are basically a couple of tests. Sometimes a third question in some cases. Like, first, are the workers being expected to take a real terms pay cut, forced redundancies, or accept poorer or less safe working conditions? Second, have the workers done what they reasonably can, short of a strike, in order to meet their needs? Now, if the answer to both those questions is yes, then the action is generally justified. My only little caveat can sometimes be, so let's say a group of workers had been getting pay increases in line or above inflation for quite a few years now. It's been fine, it's all been good, and then there was a really bad year of inflation, like this year. And then they were being asked to can you take a below inflation pay rise with the promise that we'll make it back in future years? In that case, I would say, okay, you don't necessarily need to go out and strike straight away there. That's me personally. But that is not the case here. So there's no argument there. The workers who are striking have every single one of them, been facing real terms pay cuts for over a decade now, and are being asked to take a much bigger one this year. And when it comes to RMT members, who've been throughout this strike, they are facing the triple whammy, because many of them are minimum wage or just above, workers who've been asked to take a huge real terms pay cut on top of years of pay cuts, and been told to face redundancies. And because those redundancies are not justified in terms of staffing needs, force the rest of them to work for under poorer conditions or less safe conditions. And that's how I see it. How do the government see it, though? Because how I see it, it is one way. The government's perspective of it is absolutely crucial in trying to understand what may happen. So according to Robert Peston, he's an ITV correspondent. So he said he'd been talking to ministers and officials, and he's come up with the following, that in their heads is how they see it. Now, bear in mind, some of what they are thinking is not economic fact. That doesn't matter. For them it is, and politics, of course, trumps economics almost every time. Peston reckons the government see it like this. The government's out of money. If they pay public sector workers more, they will fuel even higher inflation. If they pay workers more, that means less money for the public services because, as they say, they've run out of money. Now, we know that the government aren't actually out of money. I don't just mean because we print our own money, but because the government have access to ready supplies of tax revenues that they're not tapping into. They're also wasting money on projects that will provide zero value to the public. The problem with the government's main line of defence about inflation is they're going to have to say that a slightly below inflation pay rise for public sector workers, because they will accept that right now. So, I know some of the demands are for above inflation pay rises. That's to try and compensate for past years as well. In reality, we know when we look at some of the strike action that has worked and where workers have gone back, that a slightly below inflation pay rise will do the trick. So like nurses, firefighters and so on. So the government are trying to tell us that a slightly below still inflation pay rise for these will fuel inflation. But that well above inflation pay rises for executives, some executives have been getting pay increases of 30, 40% extra. And some other workers in the private sector, they're trying to tell us that that's not inflationary. The only way you can argue for pay restraint is if you demand it of everyone. Even then, it's still arguably not fair to let some drop below the breadline. It's one thing for someone on 400,000 a year to say, all right, I won't have an above inflation pay increase this year. But someone who's on 20,000 a year, well, they can't afford the cost of living. The one on 400 grand can. But at least you would have a case for there not being enough money if everyone had to observe that income restraint. But while well-paid people are getting large increases, and it's those on modest to low incomes who are expected to take the fall in the battle against inflation, doesn't work as an argument. And then imagine if you told people that paying public sector workers wouldn't fuel inflation like that anyway. Because, some of this pay would translate, for example, into less reliance on state or charity support. It would result in higher tax revenues for the government, unlike the above inflation pay of those who throw it all into offshore havens. It would be interested in seeing just how much inflation something like an 8% pay increase, which is still below inflation, but probably not, it's probably just enough to stave off the strikes for now. It'd be interesting to know exactly how much inflation would that add. I'd be interested in seeing the figures calculating also how much lower inflation could be if the government applied proper windfall taxes and used the money to reduce the cost of goods and services that have been driving the inflation in the first place. Bear in mind, one of the biggest drivers of our inflation is energy. Our energy costs have doubled in the last year. And this isn't happening everywhere. They always happen everywhere. No, it's not. We're paying the highest energy prices in the world. It would not surprise me to learn that there is a way of designing a budget that would redistribute wealth a bit, which would produce a net reduction in inflation, while still allowing those public sector workers to get at inflation pay. The other issue is this. The Tories have taken themselves down a path with no discernible side roads, should they need to change tactics. The road they've taken, either it gets them what they want, which is that the strikes are ended despite, crushing real terms pay cuts being accepted, or they'll have to walk back the way they came to a humiliating U-turn. I'm not seeing any flexibility in their current strategy. Also, there's no point in saying that it would be an act of self-harm to allow these public sector workers to fail and be forced to leave the profession for better pay, because the Tories want that. In fact, not only do they want that outcome as a way of running down public services, but even, if they did care, it'll be Labour's problem to deal with. All of the considerations aside, the deeper the hole they dig the country in, the longer it will take Labour to pull us out of it again. And the longer that mission takes, the harder it will be for Labour to prove that their plan is working when the Tory media are snapping at Starmer's heels from day one. So it's not just that the government feels trapped by their own economic ideology, as Peston suggests. I think their general aim is very much in line with what they want to happen. They don't feel trapped. They feel it's an opportunity. They want public sector workers to quit their jobs and take up employment in the private sector for higher wages. The government want to be able to say they're offering more training places and they're funding more nurses and doctors and stuff like that. But for the actual numbers of those professionals to go down and go and get a job in Tesco or something, that's what they want. They want there to be mass shortages of workers in public services. They want to claim that they've provided the funding, but that nobody wants the jobs. They want that so that they can argue that the public services can only work with a privatised model. But they also know that these strikes present a serious threat to them at this coming election, but potentially the ones afterwards, if they get it badly wrong as well. A Tory party that loses the argument on economic credibility doesn't come back to power quickly, unless, of course, Labour shits the bed. So they do need to end the strikes, but their ideology prevents them ending it in the simplest way, which is to make sure the workers get at least something that allows them to afford the cost of living. And as I say, they could easily do this with a tax on the well above inflation earnings of corporations and those on Solomon levels of income. The government's plan is to adopt the following three measures, as far as I can tell. First, just hope that the loss of pay that comes from striking eventually causes workers to give up and accept what will be an improved but only barely pay offer when their resolve is perceived to be weakest. Second, use the army to cover where possible. This is made more challenging when lots of sectors are striking at the same time, however. Third, introduce legislation to make it even harder to organise strike action at all. Sunak has been threatening new laws to crack down on strikes if union leaders continue to be, as he says, unreasonable. Quite reminiscent of the tough talk used on the EU before Johnson folded with both the withdrawal and trade and cooperation agreements, wasn't it? Not sure when he thinks he can have new legislation in place. Not sure what new legislation he thinks he can have in place, even if he were serious. The problem is right now, and as usual, the government have not thought about any actions that might be needed in advance. That's what tells me there's probably quite a bit of bluster to this. Because let's imagine you did think that unions have been unreasonable here. Let's just say. And that Lee Anderson's right, you could eat for 30p a meal. What do you want to get paid more than £2 a week for? What are you going to spend the extra 50p a week on? So you think they're being unreasonable. You think that new legislation might be needed to crack down on it, okay? So why haven't they done anything before now? They will have known that the economic situation was likely to lead to industrial action for over a year. Boris Johnson this time last year was denying it, but mainstream journalists were asking about it. Everyone knew that there was going to be high inflation. We didn't even know that Russia was going to be launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but we knew there was going to be high inflation. So the government knew there was going to be widespread industrial action, likely a year ago. They knew that definitely there was going to be a lot of it for half a year now, because it's been in the works for half a year now. Some of it started half a year ago. So why hadn't they laid the groundwork? Why hadn't they thought, we're gonna find this situation in about a year's time? Let's prepare for it. They haven't. So any threats are going to look a little bit weak when they've done nothing at all. Also, has to be said, Keir Starmer did say he'll repeal any new anti-strike legislation during the few days when Liz Truss was borrowing the keys to number 10. So I don't see how this is a threat to unions or their members. But again, that won't worry the Tories either, because they only need the legislation, if they need it at all, when they're in government. They don't mind strikes when Labour are in power at all. The only question is, can Sunak actually use these three devices to break the workers' resolve? If he can't, he's just going to take a bigger and bigger economic hit. And we know from past history, when these things drag on, it is the government the public turn on, not those striking. And the public are already broadly on the side of those strikers. It's not overwhelming, but it is more on their side than not. Sunak, of course, may think he's got a plan to make it different this time. All I would say is that his plans so far don't exactly seem to have worked. He's already made 2 huge U-turns to stave off rebellions from within his own party. I'm not sure there's any evidence as yet that he is a strategic mastermind. And if it turns out that he isn't a strategic mastermind, what he's actually looking at is something close to a general strike this month and beyond. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.